When Europe trembled, one king rose like a lion. This is the story of Richard the Lionheart and the Third Crusade. The news traveled like a cold wind across Europe, whispering through monasteries, castles, and marketplaces. Jerusalem had fallen. For almost 9 decades, the Holy City had been under Christian rule, a distant yet burning symbol in the hearts of kings and commoners. But in 1187, under the command of the formidable Sultan Saladin, the city surrendered after the fateful Battle of Hattin. The cross that once crowned its walls was lowered and the crescent rose in its place. The shockwave was immediate. No king, no bishop, no knight remained untouched by the weight of this loss. And in the great courts of Europe, something ancient stirred. Honor, ambition, devotion, and vengeance began to breathe again. It was in this storm of emotion that a young king in the West began to rise, his name murmured with equal fear and admiration. Richard of Anjou, newly crowned King of England, already known on battlefields long before his coronation. He was a man raised in war, shaped by rebellion, sharpened by betrayal, and born with the heart of a predator. They would later call him the Lionheart, but the truth is that the lion in him had always been awake. Jerusalem merely gave it a battlefield worthy of its roar. While Richard prepared, the rest of Europe struggled with the enormity of what stood before them. France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire had long been tangled in rivalry, envy, and fragile alliances, but the fall of Jerusalem forced the hands of kings. Pope Gregory Roman VIII issued the papal call for a new crusade, urging Christendom to reclaim what had been lost. The German Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, already a legend in his own right, was the first to answer with a massive army that shook the earth as it marched. His presence alone inspired hope across Europe, for if any man could bring victory, it was the iron-willed emperor crowned in the snow of the Alps. But fate has its own designs. As Barbarossa led his forces across Asia Minor, the unthinkable happened. The mighty emperor drowned while crossing a river, an ending so quiet for a man whose life had been thunder. His army fractured, morale broke, and much of the force dissolved. The crusade had suffered a devastating blow before it truly began. Now all eyes turned to the 2 kings who remained. In France, Philip Roman II gathered his strength, calculating and cautious. In England, Richard prepared like a storm gathering in the distance, fierce and unavoidable. He sold royal lands, emptied treasuries, and even negotiated political marriages, only to break them later, all to raise a war chest large enough to fuel an empire on the march. His purpose was clear, and he had no intention of hiding it. But to understand Richard's fire, one must understand the world he lived in. Europe was a chessboard of power, and Richard played with intensity. His relationship with Philip of France was a rope constantly pulled between friendship and rivalry. They had fought beside each other before, plotted together, and clashed just as often. Now, both kings vowed to take the cross and sail east. Yet everyone knew that 2 lions rarely share the same hunt without turning on each other. As preparations began, stories of Saladin reached Europe with growing fascination. He was no ordinary enemy. Saladin was a warrior of discipline and humility, a leader whose generosity to foes and loyalty to allies was spoken of with admiration even in Christian lands. He had united the Muslim world with a blend of wisdom, faith, and strength that made him almost untouchable. If Richard was the embodiment of raw power, Saladin was the master of patience, strategy, and restraint. Their collision was inevitable, and the world sensed that something legendary was forming. The seas became the great arteries carrying fleets from Europe toward the Holy Land. Hundreds of ships, heavy with soldiers, horses, supplies, and the hopes of nations, carved their way across the waves. For many of the Crusaders, it was their first time leaving their homeland. They did not know the desert sun, the diseases that lurked in the heat, or the blood-soaked sands awaiting them. Some came for faith, others for fortune, and many simply because their lords commanded it. Yet all found themselves bound to a destiny greater than their own. Before reaching the heart of the conflict, Richard's crusade was tested. On the island of Sicily, he confronted political turmoil and disorder, asserting English might with force and negotiation. His presence was magnetic. Wherever he went, the ground seemed to shift with anticipation. He moved with confidence, spoke with command, and fought like a man who believed destiny waited for him in the east. But while Richard carved his path through the Mediterranean, Saladin strengthened his hold over the newly reclaimed territories. He fortified fortresses, reorganized his armies, and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. He knew Europe would return. He also knew this time they would send their greatest champions. The people of the Holy Land braced themselves. Merchants, monks, warriors, pilgrims, all sensed a storm larger than any before. Christian outposts along the coast desperately awaited reinforcements, their eyes scanning the horizon for the white sails of European fleets. And in the cities under Saladin's control, the call to prayer echoed with renewed unity as soldiers drilled tirelessly under the desert sun. By the time Richard finally approached the shores of the Holy Land, word of his journey had already spread across the region. To some, he was a savior; to others, a conqueror. But to all, he was a force impossible to ignore. The morning Richard arrived off the coast of the Holy Land, the sky itself seemed to tremble with tension. His fleet, white sails billowing like the wings of a great eagle, approached Acre, a city that had become the boiling heart of the Crusade. For nearly 2 years, Christian forces had laid siege to it, desperately holding the line against Saladin's counter. Siege from the outside. Tens of thousands had died between its walls and fields. The city had become both a graveyard and a symbol, a single spark capable of setting the entire campaign, ablaze with hope or extinguishing it forever. When Richard stepped ashore, word spread through the Crusader camp like fire, racing through dry grass. The Lionheart is here. Exhausted knights straightened their armor, ragged survivors found new strength, and even the sick lifted their heads. It was as if a thunderous drum had begun to beat in unison through the army's veins. Philip of France had arrived earlier and was already co-commanding operations, but Richard's presence changed everything. The air thickened with expectation. Richard wasted little time. Even before fully recovering from a severe fever that had nearly killed him days earlier, he inspected the siege lines, studied the terrain, and began issuing commands with sharp precision. His military instincts were unmatched. He reorganized catapults, strengthened barricades, and pushed for aggressive tactics. Under his direction, the siege weapons hurled stones day and night, pounding Acre's walls relentlessly. Inside the city, the defenders struggled to hold their positions. They were brave and disciplined, but the noose tightened. Supplies dwindled, morale waned, and the constant barrage broke stone and spirit alike. On the hills beyond Acre, Saladin's forces watched closely, launching counterattacks, volleys of arrows, and attempts to break the siege. But even Saladin could not stop the tide that had arrived with Richard. Within weeks, Acre surrendered. The banners of Europe rose over its towers, and for a moment, the Crusaders tasted victory. Yet triumph carried bitterness. Tension between Richard and Philip grew with every passing day. Philip, ever calculating and politically minded, had little desire for a long campaign. His health waned, and his suspicion of Richard, his rival and sometimes ally, deepened. Eventually, Philip announced he would return to France, leaving Richard in command. It was a triumph for the Lionheart, but also a burden. From that moment on, the entire weight of the crusade, its hopes and failures, rested on his shoulders alone. Saladin understood the gravity of the moment as well. Winning Acre was only the beginning. The true battle would come on the open field, where desert winds, discipline, and strategy decided fate more than walls or siege engines. Saladin retreated, regrouped, and prepared his elite forces. He respected Richard's ability, perhaps more than that of any foe he had ever faced. Two leaders different in every way, one fierce and explosive, the other calm and deliberate, were now set on a collision course. Richard did not wait long. He marched south along the coast, aiming for the great city of Jaffa. The heat was merciless, and the Crusader army moved slowly but steadily, keeping the sea on one side to ensure supply ships could reach them. Saladin shadowed their movements, probing, testing, attempting to disrupt their progress. Every mile was a battle of nerves. Then came the day that would define the next chapter of the crusade, the advance toward Arsuf. The morning sun rose red over the dunes, as if warning both armies of the blood soon to spill. Saladin launched a full-scale assault. His horse archers swarmed like locusts, their arrows blotting out patches of the sky. Waves of cavalry struck from multiple directions, attempting to shatter the long marching column. For hours, the Crusaders endured. Shields locked, spears braced. They moved like a living fortress under Richard's command. But even iron bends under fire. Richard watched carefully, calculating, waiting. Every commander expected him to order a charge, to unleash the heavy cavalry too soon. But he held them back, pacing like a lion waiting for the right instant. He knew Saladin wanted to draw him into a mistake. He refused to oblige. The tension was unbearable. Knights begged for permission to charge. Units began to fray under the constant rain of arrows. Then, at last, when their enemies pressed too close, when the moment was perfect, Richard gave the order. The Crusader cavalry exploded into motion. It was not a charge, it was a storm. Armored horses thundered forward, lances lowered, sun flashing off steel. Richard spurred into the fray, leading from the front as if crafted for the chaos of battle. The Muslim lines, so fluid and agile, were smashed back in a single devastating sweep. The shockwave broke Saladin's attack and forced him to withdraw in perfect discipline, refusing to let the battle turn into a rout. Arsuf became a victory carved into legend. Not because it destroyed Saladin's army, it did not, but because it showed the world that Richard was everything his reputation claimed. Saladin himself admitted admiration for his enemy's courage and command. The march continued. The Crusaders reached Jaffa, securing a crucial foothold. Richard fortified the city, knowing that holding it would be essential for any future attempt on Jerusalem. And then came the moment that every man in the army whispered about, the decision to march toward the holy city itself. Jerusalem was the heart of the crusade, the prize that had brought kings across oceans. As Richard approached, the tension was palpable. The city's walls shimmered in the heat, visible from miles away, the object of devotion, ambition, and grief. But Richard faced a dilemma few understood. The closer he came, the clearer it became that the city could be taken, but not held. The desert, the supply lines, the threat of Saladin's forces gathering behind him, the lack of sufficient reinforcements, all weighed against the idea of a direct assault. Conquering Jerusalem only to lose it again would not be a victory, it would be a catastrophe. Richard made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered the army to turn back. It broke hearts, it stirred anger. It ignited despair, but it was a decision made not out of fear, but out of calculation. Even Saladin, hearing the news, understood the brilliance behind it. Richard would not sacrifice his men or the future of the crusade for a symbolic victory destined to collapse. The war, however, was far from over. Saladin seized every opportunity to weaken the Crusaders. Richard countered with ferocious determination. Raids, skirmishes, negotiations, truces broken and reforged. Each day brought new challenges. And then came the final dramatic confrontation for Jaffa, where Saladin attempted a sudden attack to reclaim the city. But Richard, in one of his most astonishing feats, sailed straight into the battle from his ship, leaping into the fight with a handful of knights, rallying the defenders, and turning certain defeat into victory. Even Muslim chroniclers wrote of his unmatched bravery that day. The Lionheart had saved Jaffa, but he knew the crusade could not continue forever. Both armies were exhausted, both leaders were pressured by their people. A truce became inevitable. And so the two greatest warriors of their age, Richard and Saladin, crafted a peace that would allow pilgrims safe passage and maintain Christian control of the coast. They never met in person, yet their mutual respect became legendary. Their duel had shaped history. Richard prepared to return home, unaware that storms, shipwrecks, capture, and imprisonment awaited him. His journey was far from over. Yet his legacy in the Holy Land was sealed. The wind that swept across the shores of Jaffa carried with it a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow. The warriors who had followed Richard across burning sands and blood-soaked fields now stared at the horizon, knowing their time in the Holy Land was drawing to a close. Victory had been tasted, but so had loss. The war had not ended with the conquest of Jerusalem, but with something far more complex, a fragile peace built not on fear, but on the mutual respect of two extraordinary men. Richard stood on the battlements of Jaffa as the sun dipped toward the sea. He wore no crown, no ceremonial cloak, only the armor scarred by 100 battles. His gaze was fixed on the distant hills where Saladin's forces had once gathered like shadows. He knew this land better now than he ever expected to. He had arrived as a conqueror, a king fueled by fury and faith. But he was leaving as something different, a man who had seen the impossible choices of war, the weight of leadership, and the humanity of his greatest opponent. Saladin, in his own camp, prepared for the peace as well. His soldiers watched him with reverence, sensing that the war which had defined their lives was ending. The Sultan moved with quiet dignity, his decisions always guided by wisdom rather than pride. He was not a man who celebrated victory with arrogance, nor did he mourn setbacks with bitterness. To him, Jerusalem was not merely a prize, but a trust, one that demanded justice and compassion. And in Richard, he had found an enemy who understood honor, even in the heart of battle. The final negotiations had been tense, but necessary. Both armies were exhausted, supplies were low, reinforcements for either side were uncertain, and across the Middle East people, farmers, merchants, families, yearned for peace. The agreement that emerged was a testament to both leaders. The Christian forces would retain control of the coastline, especially the vital city of Jaffa. Pilgrims from Europe would be allowed safe passage to Jerusalem, guaranteed by Saladin himself. The great city would remain under Muslim control, but open to those who came in peace. It was not the victory most crusaders had dreamed of, yet it was a triumph in its own way. It was a recognition that neither side could claim absolute dominion over the Holy Land. Instead, they would share it through courage and compromise. In an age defined by brutal conquest, such an agreement was almost revolutionary. The day Richard prepared to depart, a hush fell over the camp. Knights, archers, monks, and sailors gathered to watch their king. Some wept openly, others stared in silence, remembering the battles they had survived only because Richard had stood at the front, sword raised, roaring like the lion that was his namesake. They had followed him not because he was a king, but because he was a leader who never asked of his men what he would not do himself. Richard walked among them, stopping to clasp hands, offer a word of praise, or share a brief embrace. He remembered their names, their deeds, their sacrifices. These were not mere soldiers, they were the living heartbeat of the crusade. As he reached the shoreline, he paused and looked back at the land he had fought so fiercely to reclaim. Waves crashed behind him, as if urging him forward, reminding him that duty now called him home. England awaited him, though trouble simmered there like a pot ready to boil over. His absence had created power struggles, rebellions, and whispers of disloyalty. A king could not remain away forever, even one who had become a legend in a foreign land. Richard boarded the ship with a heart heavy yet unbroken. He had not taken Jerusalem, but he had not failed either. He had given the Crusaders a lifeline, protected the coastal cities, and restored honor to an army on the brink of collapse. He had faced Saladin, a man whose greatness matched his own, and fought him to a standstill. Some battles are not decided by victory or defeat, but by the respect carved into the hearts of warriors. This was such a battle. As the ship sailed into open waters, the coastline grew smaller behind him. The towers of Jaffa blurred into the shimmering heat until finally they vanished. Richard stood on the deck long after others had gone below, the sea wind whipping through his hair, the creak of the wooden hull steady beneath his feet. He knew the journey ahead would be dangerous. Storms brewed on the horizon, enemies waited in the shadows, fate, as always, was unpredictable. Yet he faced the unknown with the same unshakable courage he had shown on the battlefield. Across the desert, Saladin stood on a rise overlooking the same waters. He watched until the fleet became tiny silver specks, swallowed by the horizon. He felt neither triumph nor relief, only a quiet understanding that the world had changed. He had matched swords not just with a king, but with a legend, and legends linger long after they depart. In the months that followed, both men faced hardships. Richard's return was fraught with peril. Shipwreck, betrayal, and capture awaited him, and he would spend years held for ransom in a cold German fortress. Saladin, burdened by years of war and the immense responsibility of uniting a diverse empire, grew weaker with each passing year. He would die not long after the crusade ended, leaving a legacy of justice, humility, and leadership that transcended his own time. The Third Crusade itself became a tapestry of contradictions. It was a war of faith and fury, yet also of respect and restraint. It was a story of kings and armies, but also of ordinary men who marched into the unknown for causes larger than themselves. It did not achieve its ultimate goal, but it prevented disaster and forged a peace that allowed countless lives to continue. And at its center stood two of the greatest figures the medieval world had ever known, Richard the Lionheart and Sultan Saladin. Their rivalry became a symbol of the strange duality of war, how enemies can destroy each other, yet also admire, challenge, and even elevate each other. Centuries later, their names remain intertwined. Historians study their battles, poets celebrate their virtues, and storytellers revive the moment when their destinies collided under the burning sun of the Holy Land. The Lionheart's roar and Saladin's calm wisdom echo through the annals of time. The Third Crusade did not end with a conqueror standing over the fallen. It ended with two warriors acknowledging the humanity in one another, choosing peace when war could no longer carve a path forward. And sometimes that is the greatest victory a man can claim. Their legacies endure not because they seized cities, but because they seized the imagination of generations. The lion awakened, the Sultan stood firm, and history itself bowed to their epic struggle. The years that followed the Third Crusade unfolded like the fading embers of a once great fire. Across Europe and the Middle East, the echoes of war lingered in the ruins of fortresses, in the memories of soldiers, and in the stories whispered by old men in taverns. The crusade had ended, but its shadow stretched over generations, shaping destinies long after the swords were sheathed. Richard's absence from England had created a vacuum that hungry men rushed to exploit. His brother John, ever ambitious and impatient, saw opportunity in the turmoil. Whispers filled the halls of English courts, rumors of a king who might never return, a lion whose roar had gone silent somewhere across the seas. Yet those who had fought beside Richard knew better. They knew that even in captivity, the Lionheart was never truly caged. Richard's capture had been an act of treachery. As he made his way home, worn and weary, he was seized by Leopold of Austria, a man whose pride Richard had wounded during the siege of Acre. Chains were placed on the wrists of a king who had faced armies without flinching, but no prison could erase the legend of the man locked behind its stone walls. Across Europe, a storm of outrage erupted. Songs were sung in mourning, and letters flew between kingdoms. Even Saladin, upon hearing of Richard's imprisonment, is said to have expressed sorrow for the fate of such a worthy adversary. The ransom demanded was immense, so large it could drain the treasury of any empire. Yet England paid it. Churches melted their silver, nobles surrendered their wealth, and common folk offered their coins. They were not simply buying their king's freedom, they were rescuing a symbol of their own strength. When Richard finally returned to English soil, he was greeted not with fear or rebellion, but with an outpouring of devotion. His people saw the scars of captivity, the lines of exhaustion, but also the same fierce blaze in his eyes that had carried him through Acre, Arsuf, and Jaffa. The lion had come home, wounded but unbroken. Meanwhile, in the east, the memory of the Lionheart became inseparable from the memory of Saladin. The Sultan's final years were marked not by conquest, but by generosity so profound that he died with almost nothing. His wealth had been given away to the poor, to his soldiers, to the families of the fallen. When he passed, the people of Damascus wept openly. His funeral procession carried the simple wooden pole of poverty, a reminder that even the greatest ruler leaves the world as humbly as the poorest man. The path he forged between faith, justice, and mercy became a model for future generations. Muslim chroniclers wrote of Saladin's nobility, while Christian writers praised his honor. It was perhaps the greatest testament to his character that even those he fought regarded him with admiration. Yet the world did not stand still after the death of its two great warriors. The fragile peace they had forged began to crack. New powers rose, old rivalries reignited, and the Holy Land once again became a battleground. But something had changed, something subtle yet powerful. The memory of Richard and Saladin haunted every negotiation and every confrontation. Leaders looked to their example, seeing not just enemies, but men capable of respecting each other even in the midst of war. Richard's final years were spent waging battles closer to home. He defended his lands in France, clashed with old rivals, and worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost during his long absence. But no matter how fierce the conflicts of Europe grew, none could rival the scale or the soul of the war he had fought under the burning skies of the Holy Land. His death came suddenly, the result of a crossbow wound during a minor siege, a far humbler battlefield than the ones that had made him famous. As he lay dying, he forgave the man who had shot him, offering mercy in his final hours just as Saladin had shown mercy throughout his life. In that moment, the lessons of the Third Crusade lived on through the man who had carried its banner. When news of Richard's death reached the Middle East, it carried with it a wave of melancholy. The last living symbol of that great duel was gone. The Lionheart had fallen not to an army, not to a king, not to a legendary foe, but to fate itself. Historians would later argue about the results of the Third Crusade. Some saw it as a failure for not reclaiming Jerusalem. Others saw it as a triumph for preventing total loss. But the truth lies somewhere beyond simple judgment. The Crusade was a turning point, a clash of civilizations that revealed not just the savagery of war, but also the capacity for honor in the darkest of times. For centuries, storytellers would recount the siege of Acre, where the earth shook under the weight of armies. They would retell the Battle of Arsuf, where Richard's cavalry split the desert like a lightning bolt. They would speak of Jerusalem, the jewel neither man would claim by force, and they would remember the moments of unexpected respect when two warriors recognized the greatness within each other. Long after kingdoms fell and maps changed, the legacy of Richard and Saladin lived on, not in the stones of fortresses or the scars of battlefields, but in the hearts of those who admired courage, leadership, and the rare ability to rise above hatred. In the end, the Third Crusade was not a story of victory or defeat, but of humanity revealed through conflict. A lion roared in the west, a sultan stood firm in the east. And between them, history watched as two titans shaped an age that would be remembered for 1,000 years. Centuries passed, but the memory of the Third Crusade refused to fade. Like an ancient flame flickering through the corridors of time, it burned in chronicles, in poems, in songs carried across deserts and rivers. The world that Richard and Saladin once walked transformed beyond recognition. Empires rose and collapsed, borders shifted like restless tides, Kings and sultans came and vanished, but their story endured. It endured because it was more than a war. It was a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both its fiercest darkness and its brightest honor. In the decades following Richard's death, Europe fractured again into rivalries and ambitions. New crusades were called, none commanded with the same thunder or guided with the same brilliance. The leaders who followed lacked the fire that once radiated from the Lionheart's presence on the battlefield. Their banners flew high, but their hearts faltered. And in the Holy Land, without the balance maintained by Saladin's wisdom and justice, internal struggles simmered, threatening the unity he had fought so tirelessly to preserve. Yet even as nations quarreled and armies marched, the legends grew. Monks illuminated manuscripts with golden depictions of knights clashing beneath sun-scorched skies. Arab storytellers recited tales of the noble Frankish king who fought with the strength of 10 men. Scholars in distant lands wrote of the Sultan whose generosity equaled his valor, and children, whether in English villages or Damascus markets, grew up imagining the day these two lions of history had circled each other on the desert sands. The passage of time softened the harsh edges of the Crusades. What had once been a desperate struggle for land and faith slowly transformed into a saga of character and courage. The brutality remained in the written records, but so did the respect that had defined the two greatest leaders of that era. Even enemies found themselves inspired by the stories, for they revealed something rare, the capacity to remain honorable even when the world demanded blood. In the centuries that followed, historians uncovered letters and chronicles that painted a clearer picture of the two titans. Richard, despite his temper and stubborn pride, was a commander whose men trusted him with absolute devotion. They followed him not because he was a king, but because he made them believe they were part of something immortal. When he rode into battle, the ground shook not just from the hooves of his horse, but from the force of his will. Saladin, the opposite in many ways, led not with fire but with light. His calm presence steadied armies, soothed allies, and impressed even his foes. He rejected cruelty, upheld justice, and extended mercy in a time when mercy was often mistaken for weakness. His strength came not from intimidation, but from dignity, and in that dignity lay a power that outlasted every victory and defeat. The legacy of these two leaders shaped diplomacy long after their bones had turned to dust. Ambassadors, generals, and kings studied their strategies, their negotiations, their decisions. Their campaigns became lessons in leadership. Their respect for one another became an example that future generations struggled to match. And the uneasy peace they forged, born of exhaustion but sustained by wisdom, remained a blueprint for centuries of treaties. There were moments in later ages when the world seemed to forget the lessons of Richard and Saladin. Wars erupted, driven by greed or blind ambition. But every time humanity stumbled toward darkness, scholars reminded them of the crusade that had once ended not through domination, but through understanding. The story became more than history, it became a warning and a guide. Across the Mediterranean, ruins of old fortresses still stood against the winds. At Acre, where towers once shook under the thunder of catapults, only fragments of walls remained, covered in sea salt and time. At Arsuf, where cavalry once thundered across the sand, the dunes stretched silently beneath the sun. And at Jerusalem, where both men had turned their eyes with longing and restraint, pilgrims of every faith continued their quiet prayers. Generations later, travelers walked these ancient paths without realizing their feet traced the same ground Richard and Saladin had once stood upon. They did not hear the roar of the Lionheart's charge or the calm commands of the Sultan over the sands, yet the echoes lingered. Some said they could still feel a strange weight in the air, as if history itself breathed through the wind. By the time the modern era dawned, scholars spoke of Richard and Saladin not as conquerors, but as symbols of what leadership could be when courage met honor. Writers imagined their meetings that never happened, painting scenes where respect bridged the chasm between faiths, Sculptors carved their figures into stone. Filmmakers revived their battles with sweeping music and blazing fire. And through each retelling, the world remembered. And so the Third Crusade, once a chapter of fury and steel, became something greater, a reminder that even in the harshest conflicts, humanity has the capacity to rise above hatred. It proved that rivals could admire one another, that leaders could choose peace over pride, that dignity could survive amidst the ashes of war. Richard and Saladin had fought for lands, for faith, for duty. But in the end, their greatest legacy was the way they faced each other, not as monsters, but as men, men who recognized the strength in their opponent, men who understood the heavy crown of leadership, men who carried the weight of thousands of lives with courage, frailty, and determination. And centuries later, the world still looked back to them, not because they conquered, but because they endured. They endured in the memory of humanity, woven into its spirit, the Lionheart, the Sultan, two worlds, two faiths, two destinies, bound forever in the great tapestry of history. The fire of their story still burns, undimmed by time. And as long as people seek courage, wisdom, and honor, their names will never fade. When the dust finally settled over the scorched plains of the Holy Land, one truth remained unshaken. The Third Crusade was not merely a war of swords, shields, and banners. It was a collision of worlds, a struggle of wills, and a meeting of two men whose names would echo across the centuries like rolling thunder. Richard the Lionheart and Sultan Saladin. Their armies marched home, their empires shifted, but the legends they carved into the earth remained untouched by time. History remembers victories and defeats, but what happened here was something far greater. It was the moment when chivalry itself was tested in fire. When a king who roared like a lion met a leader whose mercy was as formidable as his strength. No treaty, no conquest, no battle ever fully defined their rivalry. Instead, it was the respect shared between them, the rare honor found on opposite sides of faith, that transformed this crusade into an immortal tale. Richard returned to Europe scarred but unbroken, a warrior whose bravery became the measure of kingship. Saladin remained the guardian of Jerusalem, a leader whose wisdom safeguarded an entire civilization. Neither emerged with everything they wanted, yet both walked away with something greater than victory, a place in the human story that could never be erased. The Third Crusade changed borders, but it also changed people. It showed that even in the most brutal chapters of history, courage can coexist with compassion, and enemies can rise to become legends not through destruction, but through dignity. The world watched two lions meet, clash, respect, and retreat. And in that moment, humanity learned that greatness is not found only in conquest but in character. Centuries have passed since the last war cry echoed across the deserts of the Levant, but the ghosts of that age still stand tall. They whisper through ruined fortresses, through the silence of ancient battlefields, and through the stories we continue to tell. The Third Crusade did not end with a decisive victory. It ended with something more meaningful. Reminder that the destiny of nations often rests not in triumph or defeat, but in the courage of those willing to face impossible odds. And so the lion sleeps again, but his roar endures. The legacy of this crusade is not buried in the sand. It lives in every lesson of leadership, every act of honor, and every generation that looks back and says, "Here walked giants. Here rose kings, here in the heart of a war-torn world the lion awakened, and history was never the same."